The end of OPEC and peak oil. So then, is this the end of OPEC? A steep plunge from $150 a barrel to less than $50 a barrel for crude oil in less than 5 months has opened huge fissures in the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. Some members, such as Iran and Venezuela, are desperate to raise oil prices so they can balance their national accounts. But more conservative members, such as Saudi Arabia, can balance their budgets for now at current prices. And they have room to fear they will be the new scapegoats if the global recession gets worse or deepens. We've sat death watch for OPEC before, but this time the cartel's future looks especially bleak. Its November 29th meeting in Cairo, Egypt ended with members very deeply divided. The Venezuelans and Iranians of OPEC have dug themselves into such a big pit, in such a big spending hole, that the only way out would be for OPEC to raise prices by cutting production even further, while letting the cartel's hardest pressed members cheat. Of course, OPEC couldn't agree on any production cuts in Cairo, but promised to revisit the issue in December. The burden of production cuts would fall almost totally on the Saudis and other conservative Middle Eastern oil producers. That's why the Saudis didn't buy into that deal in Cairo, and why they might balk again. That result could leave OPEC standing, but effectively end the cartel's power to change the balance of global supply and demand. Just a paper tiger. In the short run, that would be good for consumers, as far as prices go, but in the long run, it would lead to global energy chaos or a catastrophe. So where is oil demand still growing? And how did OPEC get into this mess? Consumers in OPEC countries are becoming just as addicted to oil as their counterparts in the United States. According to the latest forecast from the IEA, International Energy Agency, oil demand from the world's developing economies will fall by approximately 3 million barrels a day between 2008 and 2030. Of course, this is all theoretical. In that same period, the countries of the Middle East will be one of the 3 major sources of oil demand growth in the world. Overall, approximately 43% of global oil demand growth will come from China, according to the forecast, with India and the Middle East contributing 20% each. It's easy to understand why China's and India's oil demand is growing so fast. They have huge, immense populations, 1.3 billion and 1.1 billion, respectively. And their emerging middle classes, they're just starting to buy cars and the other high consumption trappings of developed countries or economies like the United States. But the Middle East, Egypt, the most populous country in the region, has approximately 80 million people, Iran 70 million, Saudi Arabia just 27 million. So why are these countries projected to add as much to global demand for oil as India over the next few decades? Demographics plays a part. These are some of the youngest and therefore fastest growing economies in the world. And national investment plans heavily favor oil and energy intensive projects, such as more oil production and chemical plants. And the governments are hooked on oil. They have to have oil to balance their budgets. The problem confronting OPEC is that it increasingly looks like it might have to take huge production cuts to just stabilize the price of oil. OPEC agreed to cut production by 500,000 barrels a day in September, and then an additional 1.5 million barrels a day on October 24th. But it now looks like those two promised cuts, not completely of course carried out, reduced production in November to 30.98 million barrels a day, down from 32.2 million barrels a day in October. And even cuts of that magnitude haven't stemmed the decline in the price of oil, however. Now, some OPEC members are calling for even more production cuts of at least 1 million more barrels a day and perhaps as much as 2.5 million. The burden of the cuts so far has fallen most heavily on Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia accounted for approximately 44% of November's projected production cuts, and as OPEC's biggest producer, Saudi Arabia would be expected to pick up the bulk of the next round of cuts. The Saudis produced 9.45 million barrels a day in September, and that's roughly a third of OPEC's total production. OPEC's November 29th meeting showed that the Saudis aren't yet willing to step up to the plate with another 500,000 to 1 million barrel a day cut in production at a time when the government is announcing cancellations and delays in its plans to diversify the Saudi Arabian economy. Adding up all the cuts actually delivered showed that OPEC had cut production by only 850,000 barrels to 1.2 million barrels a day instead of the 1.5 million promised in October. OPEC's inability to agree on any additional production cuts means oil prices will fall further, or could fall further, but the problems confronting the governments of oil producers such as Nigeria, Venezuela, and Iran will ratchet up toward crisis mode. Then there's Russia. At the same time, the lack of production cuts in Cairo will increase short-term pressure on Iran and Venezuela to cheat on the October production targets and keep production above quotas. Due to a near civil war in its oil fields, Nigeria's production is falling with or without OPEC quotas. That in turn could make the Saudis even less likely to want to cut production to bail out OPEC members who haven't kept to their quotas. And even though it isn't an OPEC member, Russia will play a big part in deciding how the future of OPEC plays out. Russia, which produces roughly as much oil as Saudi Arabia, has made noises about coordinating its production policies with OPEC. So far, those noises are just that, and the country shows no signs of following OPEC's lead by intentionally cutting production. So the sight of a non-OPEC Russia taking advantage of improvements in oil prices created by Saudi Arabia's cuts in production will just increase Saudi resistance to disproportionately sacrificing for the profit of the others. So OPEC could become a shadow of its powerful self. All this wouldn't be enough to cause a formal breakup of OPEC, but it would be enough to reduce the cartel to a powerless shell. OPEC could effectively break up into regional or ideological subgroups, each pursuing its own market agenda, and a further breakdown could see individual oil producers inside and outside OPEC pursuing strategies based only on self-interest or greed, pure greed. And consumers around the world would cheer at the breakup of OPEC, or at least some of them would, or even at its dissolution into a powerless shell organization. Without OPEC, individual oil producers would pump as much oil as they could in the short term, and oil prices would fall, but only in the short term. And that's not good news, of course, for companies that make their money selling oil field infrastructure, because lower oil prices would mean less money to invest in oil field development. It would be really bad news for companies developing more expensive, unconventional sources of oil, because they couldn't even make a profit competing against cheaper oil, and it would be devastating to emerging alternative energy technologies, which would be forced back into reliance on government subsidies at a time when governments have plenty of other things to do with their money or to worry about. And if you believe in some version of peak oil, but in a post-OPEC free-for-all in the our oil markets looks like a disaster or a coming catastrophe. So, this is not going to work. And these are more signs of the end times. Transition days, and there are many, many signs.